This is a lecture on the chapter on organizational diversity processes. The chapter itself is pretty explicit. I'm going to highlight a couple things I think are interesting and ask some open-ended questions about stuff that the book maybe doesn't cover as extensively as I think it might. The first chunk of the chapter discusses sex and race, and then briefly discusses sexual orientation or sexual gender identity, and then disability and the American Disabilities Act. So those are obviously prevalent forms of discrimination that are very visible, and that there are legislation around. But what other kinds of discrimination are there? So the book talks about sexual harassment, but it does not talk about physical appearance as a form of discrimination. So if a woman or a man is given preferential treatment due to having a very nice physical appearance, or is expected to respond to comments or behaviors that are based on their appearance, that is one form of discrimination. That whoever is approaching them that way is making assumptions based on their physical beauty or symmetry. On the other side of the picture, people who are overweight are less hired than people who are not. Certainly in the opera world where I came from, although people tend to think opera singers are all largish people, the reality was that discrimination based on appearance was rampant, certainly under the shadow of Hollywood and increasingly stringent requirements for physical beauty. In Hollywood made your appearance sometimes more important than your ability to sing the role. So one would think that that is in a sort of fringe or marginal industry like the entertainment industry, more of a thing, but it's also very prevalent. That type of discrimination for men and women, but particularly women, is also very prevalent in the workplace. So not meeting physical standards, not being conventionally beautiful, or meeting the current social norms of beauty can also be a reason that you are not given a job, not promoted, or not seen in a favorable way. Just as the book talks about false assumptions that people make about people of color or women, they also make many assumptions about people based on their appearance. Ageism is another issue coming into the workplace. After college, certainly many young people are expected to be immature and unknowledgeable. And on the other side of the spectrum, people who are aging and in their 60s, moving into their 70s, certainly, or even younger in cutting edge industries, particularly in technology, can be seen as irrelevant or out of touch in the workplace. Certainly a lot of baby boomers who are aging, particularly in the technology industry, are having a difficult time adapting to the changes in how hiring and firing happen, and making the case, because they don't speak the language of the younger generations and the entrepreneurial people, they don't always have as easy of a time presenting themselves in a way that's favorable, and so they are discriminated against based on their inability to acclimate to the changes in organizational culture. And that's a major issue. Certainly religion is another thing. A woman who wears a hijab may be discriminated against if you work in a workplace that has a certain kind of ethos and you are visibly a different type, whether it's a super liberal organization and you are more conservative and openly display your religious preference. But we certainly make snap decisions about people based on their religion that could certainly also be considered discriminatory. And then what else? What other types of things are possibilities for what we think of as prejudicial thinking in the workplace? So something to think about. Intersectionality, which is not mentioned in the book, is a theory, I think from the 1970s, that is still much discussed. You can Wikipedia it if you want to get a sort of an overview of what it's about. But it is the idea that many people have multiple identities that are subject to discrimination. So if you are female and Asian, then people have a certain set of assumptions about you because you're female and another set of assumptions because you're Asian, and those two interact. And then you may be privileged in some ways and not privileged in others. So, my appearance, my height, my age, and my gender all say one thing about me, but then I'm also white, which sticks me in the privileged category. So we all have these areas in which we are in some ways privileged and in some ways less privileged. And for some people, the less privileged is heavily stacked not in their favor. And so the idea of intersectionality is to become more conscious of the different types of identities that people are grappling with that limit their behavior and their ability to stand out, rise up, or be seen as assets in the workplace that have nothing to do with their abilities. So when we think about discrimination, try not to think about it just in a binary black or white, male or female, straight or gay kind of way, because most of us have multiple intersecting ways that we are seen favorably and have privilege, and seen unfavorably and have less privilege. So it's a good idea to think about that and situate yourself inside of it. And even if you fit all of the categories for privilege, it doesn't mean that you haven't faced discrimination in some way. It's just that structural inequality, the stuff that's kind of built into the fabric of our society, may be the kind of discrimination that you haven't faced. So as a white male, you have a certain type of structural advantage that you would not have if you were a black male or a black female or a gay male or whatever combination thereof. It doesn't mean that you haven't faced hardship or discrimination. It just means that there are certain assumptions built into our social framework that put some people pretty much at birth at an advantage or at a disadvantage. And so becoming sensitive to those things is very important. Okay, so the glass ceiling. This is a concept that's been thrown around for a long time. The idea that women cannot always rise to the level of their leadership abilities. If you do some digging around, there are some good articles on double binds and triple binds for women in leadership roles. They have to do with the fact that women are expected to fit the these gender-specific traits, like being nurturing and communicators and all of this stuff. And yet, at the same time, if you want to play with big dogs, if you want to be in the executive suite, you have to be able to relate to men as men relate. So just saying that, you can see that there's this binary split that's saying men behave one way and women behave another way, and you have to act like a man to be a woman in, the C-suite. All of which is kind of bogus in the sense that just because there are a set of traits typically associated with men and women doesn't mean that you as an individual fit any, all, or some of those traits. But you do have to deal with the preconceived ideas that people bring with them into the workplace, regardless of whether or not you embody the traits that are associated with your gender. The problem that I've seen and experienced for women in the workplace is, I think women leaders in particular are expected to be extra nurturing, extra sweet, extra hand-holdy, while at the same time they are expected to have the ability to say no, draw boundaries, make hard decisions, and that can expose them to a lot of negative talk. I had a student a few semesters ago who was a store manager, a retail manager, and she wrote and talked to me several times about being told by her female employees in particular that she was stuck up, not nurturing enough, didn't pay enough attention to them. And the woman was very kind, very conscientious, very intelligent, and introverted. So what if you are a woman and you are introverted? Does that automatically mean that you're stuck up? No, it just means that you are less likely to handhold and make people feel really good about themselves all the time, because you have a limited amount of energy available for interaction and you need to meet that out carefully. It doesn't mean that you're not a fantastic leader. It's just that the expectations of a woman in the workplace sometimes can be different than the expectations for a man. If she were a male leader, would her female employees complain? Another experience that I had that was very formative was my first semester teaching at St. Edward's. I was 9 months postpartum from having my child, adjusting to this brand new role as a mother, brand new role as a professor. Had an exciting and difficult first semester, but it was really fun and I really enjoyed it. And then I got my anonymous feedback. And anonymous feedback, just a tip, isn't so anonymous because usually we can tell who wrote it based on how they write it. And I got a comment from someone who I assume was female, who said I shouldn't talk about being mama-tired in the classroom because it was unprofessional. So just by nature of the term mama-tired, I assumed that it was a female who wrote that. And my first reaction was, oh my gosh, what did I do? Was I unprofessional? I should have fixed this. I'm so embarrassed. And then my second reaction was, whoa, wait a second. If I had come in and said I was tired from flying back from Tokyo for a consulting job, everyone would be like, ooh, you're so cool. But saying I was tired, and I never complained about being tired during class. It was just maybe like, pre-class banter where someone would say, how's your baby? And I'd say, great, but she didn't sleep all night. But somehow this person, probably woman, clued into the idea that I was violating a workplace norm by bringing, even in an informal setting, pre-class setting, the trials and tribulations of new motherhood into a professional, quote unquote, professional environment. And that was violating a social norm that I was trying to negotiate as a new mother and a new professor. So that was a really formative moment for me because I was like, whoa, crazy, crazy double standard here. And a really clear message about how motherhood and parenthood in general is viewed in the workplace as, even though it's sort of the foundation of our society, it's seen as secondary or tertiary to our value as human beings. Those of you who are parents or have parents know that that's not really the case, but that is the social norm within our corporate culture and our organizational culture. So that was really an interesting moment for me that made me think very clearly about why is it that it's not okay to bring our experience as parents into our work and acknowledge it as part of our development, but it's okay to bring in other types of experiences like sports or other professional experiences when really they're all growth experiences. So that was the first time I think I had really clearly encountered the double bind as a woman in the workplace. So part of the question, what if you're a woman who is not innately nurturing or a man who is? What if you don't fit inside of these expectations of what it is to be masculine or feminine in the workplace? Well, that just makes you a human being. But it can be confusing to people who make decisions based on these assumptions about how female managers are versus male managers. And so a question to think about is how do we deal with this? How can we break this down other than trying to fit the norms? Other than trying to change our personalities and change our behavior to not make other people uncomfortable? What are ways that we might be able to break down some of these assumptions and surface some of these assumptions and renegotiate our roles as human beings and leaders in the workplace instead of male leaders and female leaders? So what happens when you don't fit those cultural or gender stereotypes? How are you perceived? How are you judged? How do people react to you? What happens when you do fit them? Which is better? Is it good to have a bunch of people making assumptions about who you are based on how you look? Or is it better to build a reputation and build relationships and reduce the ambiguity through individualized contact? which would fit a little bit into what we discussed in the last chapter as transformational leadership. That is a component of transformational leadership, is individualized relationships. So I would rather you get to know me as Professor Michael Ann than as a 40-something, purple-haired, short, female professor, right? So there's my description. What does that tell you about who I am? Not a whole lot. You don't really know what to expect based on that. You get that from my Facebook picture, but it doesn't tell you about what my expectations are, what my weaknesses are, what I have to offer, how I can help you, what you need to watch out for. None of that. That only happens through individualized contact. And then the last part of the glass ceiling is to talk a little bit about how women are penalized for participating in child rearing. So the book talks about the on-ramp and the off-ramp. There was an article just a few months ago about women who opted out of the workplace and then opted back in. That's definitely a Gen X thing to a large extent, and maybe to a lesser extent millennials. So the idea that you have a couple kids in rapid succession and stay home to be with them until they're in elementary school or in later preschool, and then you go back into work. And I've had lots of friends deal with this. And their expectations are significantly lowered when they go back into work. They go back in at the level they were or below. And what I've observed is they almost expect to be penalized. Like there's some sense that they have to minimize their roles as parents as part of the package that they bring to work. Now, I do think that this is changing significantly because the decision about who stays home with children and who goes to work is becoming more egalitarian because it's really becoming based on who can make the most money and support the family the best. So I have friends where the husband stays home and the mother works full-time. And then, of course, there are dual mother families and dual father families. And so America is hugely behind the rest of the world when it comes to recognizing and valuing what parenting does for society and who takes responsibility for that. So the question I have is it female responsibility to raise children who become citizens? Is it male and female? Is it parental responsibility, or is it a societal responsibility? So am I and my husband solely responsible for raising our child into a good person who can be a good citizen and a good member of society and perhaps a good parent, many years from now? Or is it something that we all have to take some responsibility for? Are we in fact a village? And do we need to change how we think about the role of child rearing in society versus the role of commerce in society? Because in our personal lives, certainly those of us who are parents, I would say, I for sure, and pretty much all my friends would say that parenting is the most important role that we play, by far. I love teaching, and it is a very, very slight second to parenting, but it is still second to parenting because having responsibility for raising a child is awesomely huge, and awesomely awesome. But when we go to work, we are expected to behave as if it is much less important than what we're doing for money. And that, for me, creates cognitive dissonance. So I like teaching because there is more flexibility and I am more of an independent agent than when I was in the workplace. And what I've observed about my friends who have left and gone back to the workplace or just left for their 6 weeks of unpaid leave and come back in is that there is quite an impact. And that impact is becoming more evenly distributed, but it's still overall a much larger social issue in the United States than in many other countries, where the idea that raising children is one of the most important roles we play in society is a basic assumption, whereas here, for some strange reason, it is not. All right. So, how are we adapting and adopting diversity in our workplaces? Well, whether or not the laws are catching up, and whether or not all the, articles that you read online have fully admitted the importance of diversity in the workplace, it is changing anyway. And we are adapting to diversity and adopting it because we don't really have a choice. So how is that happening? Like I said, there's more stay-at-home dads and single gender parents. So if as a mother I get 6 weeks of unpaid maternity leave and my husband has an optional 1 or 2 weeks unpaid paternity leave, maybe that works because he's more of a breadwinner than I am. But if 2 men are the parents, then saying that either one of them can only have 1 week paternity leave when they adopt a child is totally insane and not good for the child and not good for them and not good for their employer and not good for society. Same thing with 2 women or a situation where the mother wants to go back to work right away and the father wants to stay at home with the child. We also are all aging into elder care responsibilities. All of us at some point have to deal with our parents aging and declining health, and that's a pretty evenly distributed responsibility because we each come with our own set of parents. And so workplaces, I certainly know that when my parents were dealing with my paternal grandparents' aging and health issues, my father constantly was in fear of being fired or penalized for taking time out to care for his parents. And that seems also kind of crazy, but is definitely a stressor in our work lives, especially if we come from small families or are only children. So the book talks about the growing proportions of ethnic groups. By 2050, 35% will be Hispanic, blah, blah, blah. Okay, in a historical context, these statements seem kind of insane because what was considered an ethnic minority around the turn of the century was Germans and Irish, and the Chinese were seen much in the way that we think of other ethnic identities that we think of very negatively. And so my family, my paternal family was Jewish and dealt with all kinds of discrimination. So in 2014, having Jewish heritage doesn't make me a person of color, it makes me fully white. But in 1940, it was definitely an ethnicity that had deep-seated discrimination to deal with. And my grandmother and her brother dealt with that, and my father in the 1960s dealt with it to a lesser degree. And so what we think of as an ethnic minority is constantly changing, and that's the important thing to think about. It is not that I want to minimize the discrimination that African Americans or Hispanic Americans or Asian Americans deal with. It's just that what we consider the other in our society changes over time, and the groups that we considered other 100 years ago are now considered white. And so who we choose to disidentify ourselves with and discriminate against is going to change over time. What we need to deal with is how do we deal with the human impulse towards discrimination, or what sometimes my school we call othering. Silly word, but kind of works. And how do we plan for that as we go forward and as society changes, instead of dealing with a specific ethnic group or sexual identity group or whatever right now as if they are in isolation from our history as a species who has a tendency to discriminate, until we get used to a different group being part of the fabric of our society, and then we move on to another group to discriminate against. So diversity in the bottom line. The book talks about stuff like innovation, creativity. I don't know if it talks about critical thinking, but it's the idea that diverse viewpoints, regardless of what kind of bodies they're attached to, are a good thing in an organization. It means that people can look at problems from different standpoints. They can create. They can be creative. They can be innovative. There's all sorts of good stuff that comes from having multiple intellectual, cultural, and other viewpoints. But the other thing I want to say about that is, when does diversity become skin deep? So what I mean by that is, some organizations have incredibly homogenous cultures, which means that perhaps you have people with different skin colors and ethnic backgrounds and sexual orientations, but perhaps they all drive the same car, vote for the exact same people, hold the same opinions, and drink the company Kool-Aid. At that point, what has happened to diversity? Are you taking advantage of the diversity that exists in your organization, or are you filtering it out until everyone is thinking and behaving the same way? And there are a number of studies that show that corporate culture actually trumps culture of origin. So you may be this ethnic minority at home, and you may behave in a certain set of ways based on your cultural identity at home, but when you go to work, you trade those values and traits out for the ones that are acceptable in your workplace. And so that's something to think about, and the book talks about it a little bit when we're talking about cultural and other types of diversity. Because to me, in the workplace, the most important kind of diversity is the point of view that we bring. All of the things that make us different from each other allow us to have slightly different points of view. And those points of view give us the opportunity to think critically and to innovate. So that is what I have to say about diversity.